letting people in.
Sweet.
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
How are y'all today?
Yeah,
Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us here. So,
We're excited.
we will start in about 5 minutes officially, at like 5. Up until then, we can just chat or say hi.
What do you want?
Lucas, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Do that one, yeah. Oh, wow.
It should be coming. Oh, I know one.
Hello?
Wait, I want to hear him.
Somebody's getting FaceTimed. I love this.
These are wonderful.
Adam, this is always fun at the beginning.
You there, Lucas?
There we go.
There you go. Perfect.
There was a lot of, someone was getting a Skype call, I think. It was a little intense for a second there.
No, yeah, a lot of beeping there. So, as I said, let's wait about. We still got people joining at a pretty good clip, so let's wait like 3 minutes more or so.
Cool. Those of you who have the wines, we're going to do the Grenache first, and then the Merlot, and then the Cab Franc.
Yeah, and by all means, feel free to go ahead and start drinking. Lucas and I are much more entertaining if people are drinking. So
yeah, that's true. Everyone's funnier if you're drinking.
I will briefly let Diana in here. How are you, Diana? I think I unmuted you.
There, I'm well. How are you?
Good to see you.
Hi, Diana.
Hi there.
How are you?
Good. Happy to drink some more today. Did a lot of drinking yesterday.
Yeah, Diana and I and Jeff there from
I heard
managed to do our fair share of drinking yesterday, starting early, like 8:30 in the morning, and going from there. So
whoa, yeah, that was professional. Yeah, no, I tasted all those barrel samples that Jeff brought by. Thank you for dropping those off.
Of course, of course.
Nice. We have a good turnout here.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Really good group. So
very good. Sweet. And just to kind of catch everyone up, if you guys want to drop questions in the chat, Jeff Schaefer, who's our sales director and used to work with Adam and Diana at Siduri, is here to answer questions. He's not on video because it would probably hog all the bandwidth. We have.
So the chat's at the very bottom of the of most people's screens there, and so you
need to hit that chat button. But if you have any questions, and we're gonna try and stick to those or answer them as we go. So feel free to jump in there.
All right, things are slowing down as far as people joining up. So Lucas, why don't we get started? And as you said, we're starting with the 2017 Grenache, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 2017 Grenache, Hoskins Ranch. We labeled this a reserve. It looks like this. It's the only one in a Berg bottle.
Mine's stained a little bit. Sorry, it was bad pour on my part.
This is.
Tell us a little bit about the wine, and then we'll start talking about your history a bit. But go ahead and give everybody a little background on this particular wine, so that we know what we are drinking right now.
Sure. So the Grenache is kind of one of my. There's probably two varieties that I've kind of really taken in as kind of my kind of pet projects or varieties that I feel like, let's say I get along with them really well. Grenache is one and Cab Franc's the other. And this wine is a really special wine. This was the last year that we received the fruit from the Hoskins Ranch vineyard. We got this Grenache from 2012 through 2017. After the 17 harvest, Harold sold the vineyard. He was getting to that range of grower retirement, so into your 70s, and just kind of time to start backing off a little bit. So he sold the vineyard, and unfortunately the new owner of the vineyard, the very political version of this story is that we were not able to come to terms of an agreement going forward.
Very nice way of putting it.
Yeah, it was a very, it was a little less, it was more unfortunate than that. We kind of did our part, but we weren't able to kind of work with it going forward, which was, I think, in the long run okay, but it was definitely disappointing at the time, and we'll miss getting the vineyard, because it's always nice, as I'm sure you're well aware, when you feel like you get into a flow with a vineyard and you kind of know it and you know what to do with it and you know how to, you have a relationship and understanding. It sucks to have to start over with a new vineyard to replace it.
The two grape types that you're talking about there, Grenache and then Cab Franc, which will be the third wine that we'll end up trying here. What do you see that is similar between those? As you said, for some reason you just play well with those grapes, I guess. Do you see similarities between those two grapes
No, I do. I think that they're not similar as far as the wines they build, but they are similar in that they both, I think that my personal kind of, knack or set of talents for winemaking revolves around kind of like long-term strategy, or kind of like downstream thinking. And these are both grapes that I think really benefit from a kind of patient and long response that involves kind of a good understanding of the chemistry behind it, which I think I'm a little bit strong in generally. But what I think they both have to do is that they're both a little tough, and not to kind of toot my own horn here, but they're not easy grapes to kind of get to the window we want to put them in. And so, I have the benefit of being my dad's son, in the sense that my dad spent, almost 30 years kind of working aggressively at building a style, and Grenache and Cab Franc were both grapes he had taken on, and Cab Franc with a lot of success, but Grenache with a lot of success in making a very, very big kind of more Syrah style wine with it, but not as much in making kind of the more medium plus finesse execution we do now. But both of them are grapes that require, a good amount of bleed, a really good kind of careful hand with, how long do you want to leave skin contact on, those kinds of things that require some, kind of experience and strategy with long-term experience. And I've inherited a lot of that experience and then had a lot of it of my own. So I think they're both grapes that benefit from that.
I look at them both and as there's some aromatic things there that I don't know that I find them similar, but that the aromatics are incredibly important to be successful on either one of these. And not that aromatics aren't important in all wines, but I think that in those two, I think that it's really key.
Yeah, no, I think that this actually is not something that I would tell you I came up with myself, but it was really more of a reaction to my dad's winemaking, where over 20, 30 years, he really pushed hard on this kind of like on trying to execute his vision for what the style of the wines would be. And he got there, but the kind of slight kind of downside to that execution of these kind of big tannic, structure forward, age-worthy wines was that when you're really focusing on that part of the wine and less so on the front and the fruit, you kind of start pushing really hard on tannin extraction, you start making all the wines kind of taste similar. And so for me, when I kind of came in and took over the winemaking, the first thing for me was, okay, if we're gonna make Cab Franc along with like 4 or 5 different Cab and Cab blends and Merlot and whatever, then Cab Franc really needs to be Cab Franc, and it needs to feel like Cab Franc and communicate that Cab Franc. The same thing with Grenache. The way that my dad was making Grenache was really kind of more like a very, very big, heavy extracted wine that felt a lot more like Syrah to me. And so to me, when I came back to Grenache, it really made, it was a big point of concern for me to make sure it was really a clear execution of what Grenache is, of what the Grenache grape feels like, and how it's different from Syrah, not how it's like Syrah.
What are we drinking now? I'm sorry, we got on late, so what are you starting with?
We're drinking with the Grenache. We're going to do Grenache, then Merlot, then Cab Franc. Yeah. So with the history of Meeker, and Meeker having been around for some time as far as a winery goes, and I mean, if you want to touch just briefly on a couple of highlights there, Lucas, but what was, and I think you've told me that your intention was not to take over the winemaking at some point in time. I mean, that was, in fact, it was anything other than that at one point in your life.
Yeah.
Are there positives and negatives to taking over the mantle at a place that's been around for a while?
Yeah, there's definitely negatives. There's positives too. Positives are, I feel like to some extent, this is a challenge as much as it's also positive, is that when you have a set of kind of traditions and history that were handed to you or that you inherited, you kind of, a lot of young wineries and winemakers really struggle with kind of finding an identity. But that identity was here, before I ever started making wine. And a really nice part about what our identity has been is that it's really kind of progressively minded, in the sense that while our style goals are really consistent, my dad's never been the person who, like, once he finds one method that works, like, that's good enough and we're only doing it that way. He was always a very experiment, prototype, try new things kind of person. So for us, there's always been this kind of, we're never done learning, never done experimenting, never done trying to be better at what we do side of it. So inheriting that part's really fun. That's really a big part of the spirit of what we do. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of that classic, you hear about this when when like professional athletes have kids that become professional athletes. Everyone wants them to be like their dad, and they're like, I play a different position, leave me alone. And so it's kind of, there is that tension where it's like, I have to kind of live up to and execute the wines that were handed to me, but at the same time, like, I have pushed them not in a different direction, but really I've kind of, I think, sharpened the attack.
And I assume you kind of have to make those decisions over time a little bit. I know that Dianonite, Siduri, and all that would be reluctant to make big changes if a wine was very popular. If you do it very quickly, you get customers' heads spinning real fast, and they don't know what they're getting. And that's it may be great from your experimental nature or mine or hers, but it may also then lose all your customers, and that sucks pretty badly.
Yeah, no, and that's actually, I think, what's really cool about Meeker is that because my dad kind of, baked into what our identity has been, is always that as long as we do these, these core wines that we always do. But then part of our identity has been that we're also going to do weird stuff you've never seen from us before, or that's going to intentionally be different from what you've seen before. And so that gives me, and generally our process, like, a lot of space to play, in the sense that, like, those experiments, those things we want to try, those things we want to do differently, or new grapes or new vineyards, new regions, whatever, that there's space in the Meeker process for that. And in fact, we have to have that. That is a big part of who we are. And so that's really fun, because I feel like a lot of winemakers get, for lack of a better word, bored. They get bored of making this, especially at like the classic Napa style houses where they make 3 or 4 wines. You guys only made Pinot Noir, but you made it from so many different places that it was, a whole different ballgame. And Pinot Noir is a grape that reacts well to that kind of variety. But, like, can you imagine making 30 different cabs a year? Like, I would get so bored so fast.
Yeah. So someone's asking a question about, did you look with Grenache to a location to try to reflect, like, Spain, France, Priorat, Chateauneuf?
No, I would say that I really looked. It's really actually interesting. I think the one thing that's pretty different for me from most California winemakers, I feel like a lot of California winemakers are heavily influenced by the old world in a direct way, where they say, okay, I want to make this grape, and I'm going to make it like they make it in that region over there, where that's kind of their point of influence. But I grew up in the wine business. My earliest memory is face and glass of Zinfandel juice when I was, holding onto the arm of my dad's chair like this. So I was a toddler at some point. And so for me, the point of reference that I look to that kind of catches the core of my being and my soul are the wines that were made here, the kind of the peasant Italian-American, early first or second wave, wines in Dry Creek in northern Sonoma County, where the wines were really, really blue collar, and I mean that in the most complimentary of way, in the sense they were very pragmatic wines. They were acidic, they were tannin forward, they were structured, they were meant to age well. They were essentially meant to be easy to take care of in the cellar of the house while you went about farming the stuff that made you a profit. And so those are the wines that were the core of how my dad learned, because a lot of his mentors and influence came from that world. But also my dad just wanted to make left bank style, high aging, long window wine. That was his idea.
Right. So on that question, and that's one of the things. So first off, I carried Meeker wines in Texas back when I was in wine retail in the early 90s. I mean, so I always remember them as wines that aged well, sometimes needed almost aging.
Yeah, a lot of our wines do need. I mean, like we tell our wine club members when we send out the newsletter, like, hey, like this wine's drinking pretty good now, or you need to wait 6 months, really, honestly. And the reality is that most of our bigger reds, the Merlots, the Cab Francs, like we really, generally when we pull bottles from the cellar for us to drink, we're usually looking in the 4 to 6 years at least from vintage date. So like right now in 2021, we'd be looking for the 2015s or older.
So there was a whole time in California wine, though, that immediacy became more valued than age worthiness, it seems like.
And it seems like we just kind of stuck our head in the sand and we're just like, no. Like that was basically my dad's response was that, I came here to build age-worthy wines. This is what I wanted to do. This was the goal. And so basically that's actually a really good point to pivot back to the Grenache question, which is what ended up happening was we were like, when I took over the Grenache program, I said, when we make it into essentially a really big Syrah, we're kind of just putting it in the same place that the Syrah's in.
Yep.
And really, so for me, coming back to Grenache was really a way of saying, I had made Pinot Noirs as under my first label. That was kind of my first foray into winemaking. And for me, it was a way of saying like, okay, we have this idea of how we like to make Pinot Noir, like how we like to build Pinot Noirs, which was also, more acidic, more tannic. And then and basically I said, well, if I'm going to make Grenache, it's basically, I want to get halfway between Grenache and Pinot, or Syrah and Pinot Noir. And so quite literally, that's how we built the protocols. We looked at our Syrah, like what we like to do for Syrah. We looked at what we like to do for Pinot Noir. And we said, okay, we're going to have color issues because Grenache is Grenache. We're going to, need to bleed it because Grenache is Grenache. And so it started to sound a lot like how we treated Pinot Noir. And we knew that the wine that we wanted to make was kind of getting 90% of the way structure-wise to where we take Syrah. And so it really just made sense to kind of essentially think of it as a hybrid of the two. And that's really where the Grenache protocol was born. It was the first, other than Pinot, so we kind of have like a Meeker standard, how we make all our red wines, and then every variety and vineyard kind of, as we learn more about it, we tweak away from that standard process. But the Grenache was the first one that kind of really, we attacked it from the get-go differently than we attack everything except, and Pinot Noir was the grape that kind of pushed that.
Well, with my Beaumarchais wines, I've had the opportunity to work with Philippe Cambie now, who makes a lot of different Grenache-based wines all over the place. But one of the main things I learned was just time spent. And today's Philippe's birthday, by the way, so we can raise a glass to Philippe and wish him happy birthday in France. He's gone to bed by now, and I think it's the day past his birthday at this point in time. But it's a good excuse to drink. So whatever. Yeah. But Grenache is called the Pinot Noir of Chattanooga with all the different 13 red grape varieties that you can do. That's what it's called there. So
yeah, and I mean, like I didn't know that. That was that. I mean, I know that now, but I didn't know that then. It was really just a matter of like, I knew that Grenache. What I admired about Grenache is it's kind of it has this much more nuanced and gentle side to it that I really admire. To me, it feels like Pinot Noir in that way. And, it really wants to be a medium plus structured wine. And so for us and for me, when we kind of came back to it with the 2012 vintage, the biggest challenge at first was just basically, okay, where do we, essentially cut off the way we would handle this for Meeker, typically, where we're pushing for this massive tannin extraction, like, where's the line? Like, when do we press this? What, how much less work do we put on the skins? Kind of basic questions from that perspective. And then, how long are we going to age it? Because we kind of have, general predictable ideas of those things when we go into any winemaking project like you do or whatever. Yeah. And so, yeah, it was a challenge at first because it was basically like saying, okay, Meeker does this, and we want to get right on the edge of the Venn diagram into the softer side of that. And kind of capturing that is basically working outside of your comfort zone if you're a winemaker. Someone asked like how your winemaking style has changed since I first started. And this is kind of part of that is like really the way that I think about winemaking is that like I'm never done evolving and being better at it. I can always be better. And how the kind of goals for what Meeker does and what we execute really have stayed the same. But I think that we are just getting like basically trying to continually sharpen exactly how to execute that set of goals, and then kind of tangentially you know, really find better balances of how can we make the wines, you know, the downside to our wines has always been accessibility at a young age, like we talked about. And so for me, it was always like, okay, how do we make them more friendly sooner without giving up the last 10 or 15 years of aging?
So we should, from a time point of view, move into the next wine, which is the Merlot, the handprint Merlot here.
Mhm.
Which always, to me, always seemed like the biggest pain in the ass from a bottling, labeling kind of point of view.
I think it's
My
bad
Clarice
marketing for me to agree with you, but I totally agree.
much better. But nonetheless, until you know what the process of bottling is like, and labeling and getting stuff out there, those of you who aren't in the wine business, you don't realize how difficult these types of very individualized presentations can be in some ways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell
So
me
to
about,
introduce.
well, go ahead. Tell me about certainly tell me about this wine, but also maybe toss in there. So back when I was in retail, like I was talking in the early '90s and all that, Merlot was in its heyday. I mean, it was in some ways there were a number of places that, I mean, that was all the rage at the time, and then obviously it kind of fell out of favor in some ways. So tell us about this particular wine, 2016 handprint Merlot, and then also where your Merlots, how they've done over the years, popularity wise, fallen into the spectrum, that kind of thing.
So I would say, you know, it's really funny. So first of all, handprints, I love this wine because it paid for my college tuition. I mean, we've been making this wine since I was 7 years old, something like that. And it's by far our most well-known and popular wine. Most years it's our highest case volume production wine as well. You know, I also can thank it for my first promotion, because I'm pretty sure my dad promoted me to apprentice winemaker when I was like 23, just so I could handprint for him, which, you know, I will do the same thing the second I have the opportunity to take the advantage of that. But yeah, no, we really do. Really is the winemaker's handprints on every single bottle, really every single one. I promise. I hate it. But it's a big part of what I genuinely like about it is that it really communicates the kind of business we are. You know, including my mom and I. We have 8 paid employees at the company, and my dad, who doesn't take a salary because he's effectively retired at this point. But you know, we're a small family business. We really do every single bottle. So it really kind of communicates who you're dealing with, as opposed to, I think a lot of people assume there's like a secret robot that has my hand, you know, molds of my hand on it or something like that. And it's actually not like that at all. In fact, Erica, could you grab me so I'll show you the actual plaster mold that I used, that we put the paint in, because I made my own in 2009. And I've been using the same one ever since. So it's literally hand printed a few 100,000 bottles. We generally make 1,000 to 2,000 cases a year. And so it's, you know, it's a lot of time. It's about 3 weeks of our year if you added up all the hours. But it's you know, it's something that really communicates to people how much we care and how much, you know, we kind of invest in the product, quite literally. So this, you know, if you guys can get a good look here, it's got a lot of patina and character. But yeah, this thing's seen you know, years and years and years and years of use.
When your dad got you to do this, the hands fit easier on the bottle than they do now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I used my dad's mold at first, but over the years, the paint slowly fills in, as you can imagine, because you can't, you know, we wipe it up every time, but you can't get every little bit. So it's almost time to make a new mold for me, because some of the fingers are getting a little narrow to the point where it's, you know, not going to be usable anymore soon. So I've been saying that for like 3 years though, so we're not quite there yet.
We're not. You're right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So the wine seems to have, I don't know, a couple things. First off, I think one of the reasons that Merlot it didn't
Not a bad rep.
continue on. I mean, there's always the Pinot Noir sideways. People talked about that. You know,
That was actually not a problem for us. We expanded our sales for handprint like year over year for like 5 years running.
But I think Merlot might be a little more difficult to grow, and it got overplanted because it was very popular in areas that might not have been appropriate for it. And so there became a lot of, if not crappy Merlot out there, but more weedy, vegetal, just not very enjoyable Merlot there.
I genuinely think what happened with Merlot is kind of like what happened with Pinot Noir, not in the recent generation, but the generation before that, where really you had kind of two types of people making it and two types of people growing it. And the vineyards and the people making it really were thinking about effectively different wines. It might effectively could have been a different grape. And Merlot and 80s Pinot Noir and 80s Merlot were like this too. We're both like this, where there was really one side of people were like, okay, they're trying to essentially catch the like fruit forward, hyper accessible, juicy, like basically red rosé. Like they were trying to make really easy wines. And Merlot, of all the Bordeaux grapes, certainly fits the bill. And then from the eastern side of France, Pinot Noir is the winner there too.
So when you talk about red rosé, it's funny because the other wine that was very popular at that time was white Zinfandel. So I mean, it actually makes sense from a consumer point of view. Let's find the red version of white Zinfandel, if you could.
That's exactly what I think that the 80s in California winemaking were all about. They saw the success of white Zin, and they were basically like, well, how do we make? They were trying to look for kind of the next baby step, and the next baby step would have been an easy drinking red. And I think that Merlot and Pinot Noir are both kind of the grapes that kind of took that mantle, unfortunately, because what they did is they really kind of set people up into assuming that those were both grapes that couldn't execute the cab level of serious wine. And Pinot Noir got to break that mold 20 years ago, but Merlot has really been stuck with that rep it caught in the late 80s, early 90s. And and it's funny because we're not the only ones who treat Merlot like this, where we make it like a left bank Bordeaux. Yeah. Even more than a right bank, or just kind of really lean, austere, not terribly fruit forward, but really about structure and elegance and food pairing and ageability and all these things. And we're not the only ones. There used to be, I would say, like 7 to 10 Napa producers who really focused on Merlot in this same way. But a few of them in the past just year or two finally kind of cut bait, and they dropped Merlot as a SKU and pushed it into their red blend with the Syrah they couldn't sell. And so we've seen a little bit.
This remind me, Diana and I were in Bordeaux. Diana, I don't know how many years ago, 5, something. And some of the wines that we tried there, this wine is reminiscent of those. I mean, it's got a seriousness to it, a weight, tannin, but it's not Cabernet. There's not the pyrazine. There's not. It's lacking some of that. No, not lacking. I'm glad it doesn't have it, but it's distinctly Merlot, but Merlot with a seriousness of purpose to it.
Yeah, and I would say that the 16 is interesting. We were talking about making changes and how you do that slowly and carefully, and I would say that from the 14 through the 16, this wine really evolved dramatically. We really, for a long time, were so focused on such big tannin extraction from the grape that we built these massive tannin structures that take so much time in barrel to come around, and we were keeping the pHs low so the wines were nice and safe in barrel and moved slowly. And then they would age for 20, 30 years and once they're in bottle. But the problem with those wines was that they were just really hard for people who didn't know what aging wine felt like to wrap their brain around. And 20 years ago or in the 90s, you could bottle and sell wine that was that tight, and people who were in the wine trade and people who were your average consumer got that. They understood it. But it really seems to us like over the past 10 years, like that kind of base knowledge or access to that kind of style has really kind of closed off or eroded. And so really over the past 5 years, I would say that we've really kind of aggressively thought about, okay, how do we keep a handprint in the 20 to 25 year aging window, but how do we make that first year or two in bottle a lot friendlier? And so we really looked at, and this is actually something that like my personal kind of odyssey in winemaking has really been about trying to wrap my brain around how pH affects, everything about a wine's behavior, but really about how we can use pH as a tool to be more accurate and predictive with how wine behaves. And we have tons of science on that, and pH is the most important number about winemaking that no one talks about, in my opinion, at least. And it's something that's really driven a lot of my personal knowledge chasing. And I feel like what basically that then kind of folded back into the winemaking in the past, starting with the 15 vintage. And the 16 really kind of trying to dial in the pH to where we're really getting in a very specific spot and kind of slowly shifting the pHs up and getting the wines a little bit friendlier while keeping them, in a window where they're still going to do what we want over the next 30 years. So that's really been the process. And this wine is really, I feel like, kind of the culmination of what that shift was. This was the first wine that I feel like is really in the home base of where we are now. And I feel like we're really in a good spot. So the pH is now going to bottle in the mid 3.4s, right at 3.5. And with that, as we brought the pHs up, we saw the grape tannin structures that we were building evolve faster. And so we've had to supplant those with a little more oak than we were ever using before. And so there's a little more oak character on this handprint than probably any handprint for the past 18 years. And really that was just about, as we continue to make this shift upward in pH and really think about that process and react back to the wine, seeing that we needed a little more tannin help, especially as we got towards the end of the barrel aging process to keep the wine fresh and keep the complexity there. And so
I do think aging is a fascinating thing, though, in wine, because yes, I do agree that pH is something that's not talked about enough, and we don't need to go off and get too geeky here. But I think there is that question of overall balance in the wine. And so as you're talking about, maybe as you're increasing the pH a little bit on it, you need to change the oak a little bit to maintain that sense of balance in some way. So that if you throw off one thing, it's not like you can just change one thing without losing something else necessarily, or needing to balance that out.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, winemaking, the reason why you never make the same wine twice, which is of course the reason why making wine never stops being fun, is that, there's so many variables, and the variables are so broad and inconsistent that really it's a constant equation, and we're trying to hit the same answer at the end of the equation. So when one variable goes one way, you have to bring another one the other way, or sometimes with it, or it's really just about chasing the concept of balance in wine, I think, gets misplayed into thinking about how the wine tastes, but really the concept of balance to me is about process. It's about thinking about what your goal is, and then thinking about your execution and making sure that those make sense. So many winemakers attack the process with a not holistic view. The way I like to kind of say this quickly is like, if you are choosing at the first step of winemaking, just metaphorically speaking, you're choosing between A, B, and C. If you choose A or you choose C, that doesn't mean at the next set of decisions you have the next same set of decisions. You have a new set of decisions. It's choose your own adventure book. You don't get to go back and make the decisions that fit for C for A. It doesn't work like that.
Well, I think some of it can also be analogous to something like losing weight. I got sick. I got pneumonia, not COVID, thank God, but that I lost a lot of weight. I was hoping to lose some weight. Guess what? That's not a good way to lose weight. That's not a balanced thing. So you have to think about, like, okay, diet, exercise, this, that. I mean, it's you multiple things, and how are you healthy? How's that balance come out?
Yeah, and just to give a really super fast primer, the basic, the way that the reason why pH is so important for the quick intro is basically pH is the kind of it's the gas pedal for how fast a wine ages. So basically, if you had two wines that were identical, but the pH was higher on one of them, which means less acidic, it would age faster, even if everything else about it was identical to the other wine at a lower pH. So basically, the speed at which a wine ages is directly correlated to where the pH is. So more acidic ages slower, less acidic ages faster. This is why, Australian wines that come in at much higher pHs, 394, are ready in 7 months or 8 months, whereas the wines that we make need 24 or 30.
Sure. All right, so let's get to the Cab Franc, and then we can keep talking and continue to take questions. So Cab Franc to me is a fascinating grape in that there is, at least from, and you already mentioned that you don't lean towards a European viewpoint particularly, but there's a big difference between Cheval Blanc and
that's actually
and
it's a really good point. Yeah, really good point. I think
made very, very differently depending on where it's grown.
There's essentially kind of like we were talking about with Merlot and Grenache going two different ways. This is one that's actually within the tradition. There's two different ways of making this grape. One is the Noir style, where it's bottled into a Burgundy bottle, and that tells you a lot about what kind of style they're chasing. And then there's your left bank, generally paired with or blended with Merlot style, where you're really leaning towards essentially hyper lean, age-worthy Bordeaux wines. So those are fundamentally completely different styles. And we definitely are in the Bordeaux style. What I like about the Cab Franc, those two different styles, is that people choose their bottle shape based on what they're doing. So you get a little bit of a clear communication there, which is nice. But no, we really think of this as it's Cab to us. It's not Loire. It's not, in that world at all. We're really pushing on structure and age-worthy. And the nature of Cab Franc to me is, for those of you who don't know, Cabernet Sauvignon is a hybrid of Cab Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. And so basically, the things that we don't like about Cab Franc, like the green notes and the kind of herbal, vegetal character of the grape, which are type appropriate and should be there, are really kind of what they were trying to avoid when they bred Cabernet Sauvignon, and it worked. And so Cabernet Sauvignon becomes the dominant grape, and it kind of defines the next bajillion years of wine, and Cab is still king now. But to me, there's a lot to love about Cab Franc, and really it's a grape that deserves to be on that pedestal. And I think, especially as I feel like global warming is going to continue to affect winemaking, I really feel like it's a grape that's going to benefit from the kind of nuances in climate and nuances in ripeness that are going to come from that. But it's a grape that we've always really fully embraced as being, if we're going to make Cab Franc, we're not going to make it where there's no green character and no vegetal herbaceousness. Like, to me, the challenge of Cab Franc is to really find that perfect point where you're clearly communicating the Cab Franciness, where you get that a little bit of green pepper or vegetal character, but not too much, but not
And someone was asking that we talk a little more about the flavors and profiles of the wine, and I do notice that a little bit here on the nose, a little bit of that. You would not think this is Cabernet Sauvignon, nor would I necessarily think that was Merlot.
Yeah, and that's actually like kind of the thing that bothers me is I would say that there's probably a half dozen Napa wineries that really execute Cab Franc beautifully well, but I would say that of those 6, like 3 of them are really not Cab Franc. Like, they don't taste like Cab Franc. They are probably percentage-wise Cab Franc, but they don't feel like Cab. Like, those are people who are essentially working away from the grape's identity. And to me, the challenge of Cab Franc, like Grenache, is to really find its character, its varietal character, and put it on a pedestal and say, this is what Cab Franc is. When you make as many wines as we do, the goal for our wine club, when we send them a cab and two or three cab blends a year. If I'm going to send them a Cab Franc too, it better not taste like Cab. And I already sent them a Merlot. So, the idea is, if we're going to make as many SKUs as we do, which is like 20 something a year, we're really going to make sure that we're showing people what the grape's about and really make that a core value of, especially with these kind of what I would call shoulder varieties, where they're hyper related or very close to a king variety like Cab or Pinot Noir or Syrah. The shoulder varieties to me really need that identity communicated. American wines and American winemaking for so long have just tried to push those wines back into the mainstream of kind of the tradition they're related to, that you lose that kind of character.
So with us seeing, by and large, at least warmer temperatures or more extremes and all that, with Cab Franc, is that challenging in some ways? I mean, if we warm up, or if we do all that, can we warm up past some of that wonderful green character, slightly green character that makes Cab Franc Cab Franc?
To me, the challenge of this vineyard is going to be replacing it, because this vineyard got ripped out after 2018, and it was like 50-year-old dry farmed. It was planted in that kind of tea vine style of the late 70s, where like the vines were like 8 feet high, and like literally the grower did nothing. Like, the vineyard was half wild blackberry vines, and I would say about a third of the vines were dead, and like literally the only thing they did is like showed up in October and picked it. Like, that's all they did. Nothing else was needed. And so unfortunately, when you have 40, 50-year-old old dog Cab Franc vines, the kind of concentration and intensity of that fruit is going to do a lot on its own to just mitigate the vegetal character. And that's really the challenge, is young Cab Franc vines are very green. And so, the biggest problem is going to be finding the right vineyard that's got some of that more, elegance that comes with time with Cab Franc vines. We've worked with young Cab Franc vines before too, and I feel confident with them as well. But I think the reality is that essentially, basically, Cab Franc gets less green the more it ripens, but then it also gets to a point where if you're waiting for it to not be green, you've also kind of missed the window, and you've probably got raisined oxidized fruit. And so it's kind of finding that balance where you're like, okay, this is the right amount of green, and then we're going to work with it in the cellar to kind of de-emphasize that green to where we get it right in the right point. And so for us, my dad experimented for a long time with Cab Franc, and really what he focused on was what the bleed ratio should be. And so he kind of got to this core point where for him it was a 20% bleed was kind of the starting point, and then depending on that year's fruit or that vineyard, we kind of work away or work further in. Very rarely do we go past 20% bleed. I would say more commonly now, especially with that fruit because of how good it was, we were more like a 12 to 18, like 15 on average % bleed. And that's, to me, the second thing is that basically, while the skins are what hold the pyrazines, if you can kind of hyper concentrate the other better characters of the grape, then I feel like they kind of build up and around the pyrazines, and you kind of get that matching feel where everything else is also up there, and then the green doesn't stand out.
Sure.
So it's kind of a backwards, I think most people would assume that you would work away from concentration to kind of de-emphasize the green, but I think it's kind of a little bit backwards in that way.
So someone was asking basically about adjusting pH in the wine and the process. And again, you're very, very knowledgeable about these things, but without like losing everybody, I mean, tell them the easy, the shorthand version.
Yeah, so basically there's kind of two main acids in grapes that we care about, tartaric acid and malic acid. And then for red wines and about, let's say, a third or half of white wines, we convert the malic acid, the second acid, into lactic acid. So basically, in a finished red wine, you have malic acid and lactic acid. Once you convert, or excuse me, tartaric and lactic. Once you've converted the malic to lactic, lactic is a weak acid and it stops driving the pH as much as malic would have. So really tartaric is the acid that we're really focused on when it comes to like the finished wine. But basically the ways that we can control acid in a wine are when we pick, because as the wine ripens, it loses acidity and goes up in pH, and that's a conversion. The vine's actually metabolizing the malic acid, so we're losing malic acid, the grapes ripen. And then so we can add acid once we bring the fruit in. So when we pick, and then we can add acid, which is we can add any acid that's on the legal list, which includes like ascorbic and citric and a couple others. But I think that most traditional people who believe they're making traditional wines like you and I do really stick to tartaric and malic, and that's the window. Any other acid is kind of what we would consider like dirty pool or kind of cheating.
Yeah.
And so tartaric and malic are kind of the two main components that we can play with, and I would say most winemakers, 90-something% winemakers, really only think about adding tartaric. I would say that one thing that we do pretty different is that we're pretty involved in thinking about malic acid adds and how they drive finished character and the acid profile of the wine. And then, so we ferment, most winemakers would tell you that adding tartaric after fermentation's complete, you can taste it and it doesn't taste right. And I think that there's not really good science for that, but I agree that I think it's true. And then with a red wine, once we have converted all the malic to lactic, we have basically tartaric and lactic in the finished wine. And the way that we can control that is we can actually force the tartaric out of solution if we wanted to, using K2CO3 or potassium carbonate, which is basically will force the tartaric to bind up into a salt and precipitate out.
So I tend to agree with you that the number of times Diana and I have added acid after fermentation are very, very limited. I think, and you're right, there's probably not scientific study that really has showed this, but that when you add things later, my grandmother, Clarice, used to talk to me about how her husband, my grandfather, she wasn't sure when he was going to come home he was a farmer, wasn't sure when he was going to come home. So she would cook a lot of things in what is today, or was then a crock pot, or they didn't have a crock pot, but I mean a big pot, and cook it slowly and put the potatoes, the carrots, the meat, the broth, the seasonings all together, and it would all blend together. But if you added the salt at the end, you would really taste the salt then, or whatever. I mean, so that type of integration that goes on in the fermentation process, I think, science or not, I think it can be very real.
No, and like that's the funny thing is that you and I talked about this last week. As much as I think a lot of my peers and a lot of people in the industry that consider me like a very technical-minded winemaker, and that's because I think really what happens is that I'm really comfortable with the technical side of it. And I feel like that's the part that the American consumer particularly is really missing some more knowledge on. And so I feel like that's what I end up talking about a lot. But in my brain, I have a whole bunch of what I would consider like mythical or kind of like spiritual or tradition-oriented beliefs that are like very rigid. And I would say the most rigid parts of my winemaking kind of like style are really not like science-driven at all. They're personal or traditional or whatever. And one of those is that like adding acid after fermentation, like scientifically, no real evidence why that would hurt. I can think of a few maybe reasons, but like generally speaking, we just don't do it. The wines don't taste right after that.
So the one thing that Diana and I made one time that I think it really helped on, actually two, but was Gewürztraminer, where we were looking for almost that acid to stand
one
out.
exception is whites that haven't gone through ML. I feel like you can add acid to, and they're kind of in that rawer state still. And they feel like they can take it.
But and not only feels like you can take it, it's almost like what it should be in some ways. I mean, that you are not. I mean, we are not. I mean, the Gewurz was Russian River at the time. Viognier was Russian River. Viognier worked a little bit too, although we would do more of it early on. But that idea of having the acid stand out a little on those two white wines worked okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, like as someone said in the chat, like I want wines with acids from the other list.
I know, I saw that. I love that comment in some ways.
You're talking about like a sorbet and stuff. You'd be surprised how much like kind of your $20 high production but high quality wines have sorbic acid, and that's because some of them have preservative qualities. And citric acid is super common to add to high volume white wines because it's more affordable than tartaric. Tartaric acid is really expensive. It's the most expensive of the organic acids that we can buy. And then what's actually really funny is that like by far the most effective acid for adjusting pH of wine, because it doesn't have an effective solubility, and so it doesn't affect the cold stability of the wine, stuff like that, is acid that we're not allowed to add, which is sulfuric acid. We're allowed to add SO2, but there's not sulfuric acid. There's another second acid. You can help me out here, Adam, probably. It's not on the list, but I certainly know of a handful of winemakers that add it, even though it's technically illegal. But it's basically like, instead of adding like 85 pounds of tartaric to a tank, you literally add like 85 mils of a solution of. It's totally safe to consume. It's in Coca-Cola. It's used to correct orange juices a lot. And I'm dropping the ball right now on which acid we're talking about, but like a lot of these are like totally safe, but they're just part of that kind of the TTB's rules were written by essentially traditionalists.
Yeah.
And so they kind of are codifying it.
With barrels behind you, talk to us a little bit about barrel usage, what you do, what you don't do.
So what's really funny is that as kind of generally speaking, our wines are relatively low oak influence, but we are super all about barrel aging. So we have about 1,100 barrels in here. We over vintage most of our wines at least 2 years and some of them 3, which is, to quick inside baseball for people who aren't in the industry is not normal.
And I'm sure financially it's hugely successful to keep things around.
Yes, financially it's dumb is actually what you're trying to say. Yes. This is the kind of downside of making wines in our style, is that they require a lot more time, and with time comes risk, because wine in barrel is always a risk. And so there's kinds of all these, these decisions that beget other decisions. And so, we have way more wine in barrel than in a winery our size typically does. And yeah, we've always used barrel. We don't believe in tank aging because we do believe that, especially with the structures that we build, we need that air interaction through the wood to help soften the wines and bring it around. So we've always used wood. We just don't necessarily buy that much new wood. And so I would say that kind of, like I said, with the 16s and the 15s, we started pushing a little bit harder on oak. But basically for that, we're just targeting really, really nice once used barrels from wineries in Napa that only use barrels once because their wines are super oak driven. And so, we've really found a lot of success with some relatively new coopers to us, like Darnageau is a new pickup for us. You can't even go buy new Darnageaus if you wanted to. Frere just actually acquired them, which is maybe going to change things, but we've only been able to buy Darnageaus once used. These are Darnageaus right behind me. And they've been really excellent. We've really had a lot of success with them. And then I would say the second thing is that most of the new wood I'm buying, which is not very much, 10, 15 barrels a year right now, is American. I've really found that, my dad was always French, never liked American wood. And that's because my dad's experience with new wood and the new American wood was in the 70s and 80s, when new American wood was like the metaphorical oak equivalent of a sledgehammer. It was not a very delicate tool. And we're at this, time now where we're French, where I feel like, a lot of the really good American coopers are owned by the French coopers. So Canton, which is my favorite American cooper, is owned by Terrenceau, which is one of the top 2 or 3 French coopers. So, Canton makes
I've noticed that as well. I mean, not with Pinot, I am not using any American, but at Siduri, we played with it at Novi and noticed that I think for a while, your dad's impression was completely and totally correct. That let's age it quickly. I remember some study in Wine Business Monthly or survey that they did, And, are you into American oak or whatever? And they asked winemakers, and a lot of them were. And then they were like, if the barrels were exactly the same price, what would you buy? And it was reversed. Everybody was like, are you kidding? I'd buy French then, whatever. That changed. I think when some of the French coopers started buying or starting some of the American oak ventures, the price difference probably narrowed a little bit. It's still cheaper, but it narrowed somewhat. But the consistency of quality and the less obtrusive flavors that American oak can bring kind of went away.
I think what's happened too is that we've kind of learned what the code is for the cheat code for American wood. I know what French wood, for the longest time, French wood needs 2 years seasoning for it to be like right for a wine barrel. And then if you want to do 3 years, you get something a little bit different. And like basically what you saw is the French coopers came in and they started looking at the wood and they said, this just needs more seasoning time. Yeah. And so Canton, when I first dipped my toe in the Canton pool recently was with the Grand Cru 4-year, where they just age the wood 4 years before they make the barrel. And then a year after we started using the Cantons, Canton came out with the Canton 5, which is 5-year aged wood, and it's their proprietary toast, and it's all super fancy and yada yada yada. And I think that maybe there's only 1 or 2 French barrels that I would choose on anything but Pinot Noir that I would choose to use over a Canton 5. Like, I've really fallen in love with that barrel. For our wine club members who are out there, we're about to launch a new wine you guys haven't heard about at all yet. That's basically the most oak forward wine Meeker's probably ever bottled. We're kind of basically trying to do a kind of more Napa-esque style Dry Creek cab. And it's the oak character on it is 70 or 80% Canton 5 and 20% once used Darnagel. And we've really felt like we've captured something with a Canton 5 where to me, like, I maybe this is something, I mean, like, this kind of goes back to what you and I were talking about this earlier, and then also last week, like the idea that, like, I feel like so many American winemakers are just trying really hard to pretend they're French, even if their wines aren't really that French. Mm-hmm. Like the kind of marketing and everything kind of comes back to this, like, oh, we're making old world wines and we're using old world barrels and old world techniques and old world this. And it's like, we didn't have to pretend to be French starting in like 1984. Like we got off that train. We're Americans, we make American wines, and certainly the tradition is rooted in French and Italian winemaking and Spanish winemaking. But like, we do our own thing now, and we've kind of pushed the bleeding edge right up until the Australians started pushing it harder, and we do our own thing. So for me, the idea that we're trying to pretend to be French and that we should, use anything that makes us feel more French is not the motivation. Motivation for me is what makes the best wine for what we do. And with that, American wood, it just feels right to me. And I knew that, my dad used a lot of American wood in the 80s because I used to ask him, I was like, Dad, if you don't like oaky Chardonnay, why did you make so much oaky Chardonnay in the 80s? He was like, there was nowhere to buy used barrels in the 80s. Like, the way you started a barrel program in the 80s is you bought all new barrels, and then you had to put something in them to get rid of some of the oak before you used them on your best wines. And I was like, wait, so you used the new oak for the Chardonnay first to just kind of mute them before you put them on the reds? And he was like, yes. And I was like, this like completely broke my understanding of what 80s Chardonnay was. Like, I totally didn't understand that was kind of how he thought about it, because he was like, there was nowhere to buy used barrels.
Right. Do you have any concern in and I assume probably not in some of the Napa wineries that you're talking about that are buying this, because they've got money to spare. But I mean, there's always that concern in buying used barrels. Were they kept well? Were they clean? Were they, and that's a concern, at least.
Totally huge concern. What I would say is that it really depends on where you buy them from. And I pretty much only buy barrels from 2 places. One is my neighbor. And he and I share an ozone machine, and we share a barrel steamer, and so I know that he uses it. And so, and I also know that he knows that I would show up if the barrel was dirty. So, sure. There's that. I know I can trust him to be straight up with me. But the other place I'm buying it is from a company called H&A, and they're the world's biggest barrel leasers. And like, this sounds insane to people who aren't part of the wine business, because it sounded insane to me, and I am part of the wine business, but their literal whole job, just like there's whole financing companies that lease only cars, they only do car leases, all they do is barrel leases. They are a global company. They have offices in Portugal and France and Spain and Germany and Napa, and all they do is lease barrels. And it's like a multi-jillion-dollar conglomerate. And they do the financing for all those Napa wineries that have $500,000 barrel programs.
Yeah.
And part of that is that those wineries don't have use for a barrel that's been filled twice anymore.
Sure.
And so those barrels, the way that they kind of is they put those barrels on a payment plan, and they only make them pay for like 80% of the barrel cost instead of 100%, which to them is a savings. So they take it. But then they take the barrel back, and then they steam them, SO2 them, they clean them, and because they do this with such volume of barrels, they do it well. And so that company, I reach out to them usually during harvest every year once I know what my needs are going to be, and I say, hey, I want this and this, and because they sell so many barrels, they have every Cooper, every barrel. That's where I get my Darnageaux. I can't get them new.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So as we're kind of coming to the end here, I'm going to put down in the chat the website for you guys for my couple wineries as well. But I know one of the things you talked about that I really think is kind of fun and forward looking, because in some ways, as you said, when you get into the cellar, you look back 5, 6, 7 years. What wine should we open from the past? But you said, obviously, these are like key wines for you and all that, but you are playing with other things all the time. I know, like other fun things, other new things. So tell us a little bit about a couple of fun trials, fun things, or new wines that you've got coming up that could be fun and interesting that aren't the classic standard Meeker, Grenache, Merlot, and Cab Franc.
So there's kind of like, there's two projects I'm super excited about right now. The one that's been capturing the most of kind of my attention from like a personal level has been what we call the Snapshot Series, which started with a wine called No Siesta, and we're now I think 4 wines or 5 wines in. Basically the whole concept with that is kind of what I was telling you about, where we codified the idea that we like to experiment and we're going to do new things, and where it's not necessarily means that that's a new wine we're making forever. This series of wines is literally basically kind of, the idea is that it's whatever I feel like. It's kind of like a special at a restaurant. Mm-hmm. It's literally what felt good and right at the time, what I wanted to explore, what was interesting to me at the time. And so, No Siesta has its own story. It's a Syrah Zin blend. And then there was Glass Island, which has a completely different story. And it's basically, if you can imagine, a left bank execution of Zin. That's kind of what it was chasing. And then after that, it was Make It New, which was basically trying to reflexively react back to Gigondas with our Grenache program, and how do we kind of tap back into what we like about Gigondas and bring that home. And then the most recent one is called Among Links, and it was basically kind of riffing on the concept of Jura Pinot Noir, where Pinot Noir is made with Poulsard and Trousseau, and it's not just like Pinot Noir. It's kind of like, if the metaphor I use, it's like if Pinot Noir was a college kid who went on spring break and then did a bunch of drugs and came back with dreads. It's like that. And so like that's to me what I love about Jura. And so like the clean Juras still feel like Pinot Noir, but they feel like just really weird Pinot Noir, went on like a spirit journey. And so that was what Among Links was about, was kind of capturing that idea. So hold on a second, I can show you. So like this is what Among Links looks like. All of them have a picture, which is why we call them the snapshot labels. And they're all just kind of, conceptual and unique and fun. And it's also kind of like a way of me being able to reach into the cellar and find the stuff that I think is most worth using and using it in a new way. And that's really fun. And then the second thing that's really capturing my attention right now is kind of just, like I said, we lost this Cab Franc vineyard, we lost this Grenache vineyard, which for us were body blows. Those were 2 vineyards that I would have been happy to keep making 30 years from now. And so really replacing those vineyards has been a big challenge. We still haven't found a home for the Cab Franc, but the Grenache program, I think what's kind of been born out of that loss was this idea that we're now going to make, I'll be honest with you, Adam, the way that we describe it is we're going to be the Siduri of Grenache. Like, we're just basically going to chase a half dozen different single vineyard Grenaches, and we're just going to chase this idea of Grenache as a powerhouse grape that should be treated like as such. We really felt like we have a home and an affinity for the grape, and that we get it, like I said, we get along. And so I feel like it's a move. We see some anticipation side of it. Like, I feel like Grenache is ready to kind of pop. And so, yeah, we're working this year. We made some from Paso.
And you finally sold me a little bit, and that was
so
great.
And so that's really exciting. And then the new home for our kind of bigger Grenache up in Mendo is an incredible vineyard, organic, dry farmed, and that block just came online, got replanted to Grenache, and we own that block, not literally, but we have that block long term. And The grower there is salt of the earth, just like Harold Hoskins was for this block. So we're really pumped about that. And then we have a vineyard over in Sassoon that we're going to bring online, hopefully for a little bit higher volume price point Grenache at some point soon too. So we're, kind of, I'm looking to try and anchor something kind of between Mendo, and I would love to bring Grenache back from Sonoma County because it's it's my home. So the Grenache program really excites me right now, and also just what the Paso fruit taught me and what's going on down in Paso's more interesting than I kind of gave it credit for, and so I think that we're going to chase a little bit more fruit down there too, and kind of bring that back into the fold. And then the other thing that we're doing right now is really thinking hard about what our next adventure with white grapes is going to be. And
so a couple of real quick questions. We'll kind of get them done, and then we're an hour in. So the chase for vineyards or finding vineyards these days harder than it was.
I don't think finding the vineyards is hard. Finding the right people you want to work with is hard.
Right.
Lots of vineyards out there now, way more than ever. But a lot of the people who own them are not the kind of people you want to work with, and that's, I think, really the issue is you have to find it's almost like finding someone you want to be roommates with more than it's really like finding a vineyard that makes good fruit. Plenty of places.
Diane and I would find that for a long time as well, dealing with as many different growers as we did making Pinot. That at some point, if you had a grower, even though the location is great, the clones planet, whatever, it's all wonderful. If they are very, very difficult to deal with, it takes away your focus on some of the other wines, and it's not. Life's too short. Also, quite frankly, I mean,
no, and that's, I told you, I kind of hinted at what happened with the grower who bought the Grenache vineyard, but like at the end of the day, if we really, really wanted that vineyard, had to have it, we could have kept it. That wasn't. It's not like that was off the table. It's not like we were denied the fruit. I actually walked away from it because I was literally like, if this is what it's going to be like to work with you, I can't trust you, and if I can't trust you, I don't want your grapes.
Sure.
Because when you're as busy as guys like you and I are, where we're making wine from 60, 70, 80, you now at KG, thousands of lots, you've got so much on the table that I don't want to have to double check my work. I want to text you and say, this is what's going on, and here's where we're at, and we're picking this date, and then I don't want to, stop watering or whatever, and I don't want to have to worry, did he actually stop watering? Like if I have to worry about that, we're already in the wrong spot.
Correct. So then the last two things, number one is we need a dog update.
Dog update. Oh, my mom isn't here right now, but she has a new puppy who's adorable. But my dog has been wandering around behind me. I don't know if
I saw. Yes.
Here. He doesn't. The cellar floor is wet, so he doesn't like laying on it. But I can get him to come up. Come here, bud. Up. Come on. Up. Come on. Oh, he's getting old.
There you go.
Camera.
Hi.
So this is Ennis. He's 10, going on 11, and he's my bud. He's been part of the cellar team. We call him the crush pad supervisor. He's been part of the cellar team since he was just a little bitty puppy. He comes to work with me at least 3 days a week, sometimes, most of the time, 5 days a week, 7 days a week, whatever it is. But yeah, he's my boy.
Right. And then last but not least, I assume that, so before everything shut down, Lucas and I had the opportunity to do a prep meeting at Barn Diva for this, which resulted in 3.5 bottles between the two of us or something like that. It was a little rough one there, but I assume we can do a follow, once restaurants open up again here, we need to do a follow-up to see how this went meeting. Does that sound okay to you? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm down for that. And the other thing I was going to say I'm excited about is that we're getting ready to kind of start really pushing hard on this new baby sparkling program that we're doing, which Diana's doing like a real person, like a real sparkling wine for like adults with like budget. And I'm making like lazy sparkling wine because I don't have time to disgorge and cork things. So we're just going to crown cap on lees and let it be cloudy. And just, we're basically capturing the hazy IPA trend in wine. It looks like, I feel like we have some people out there drinking it. Yeah, I see you, Amanda.
All right.
Anything else? Any other questions?
I'm gonna unmute, or everybody unmute yourself. Lucas, let's grab a glass and cheer everybody that.
Wait, he has a question. I have a question.
I can barely hear you guys.
First-time
It's cloudy.
listener, first-time caller.
Yes.
What'd she say?
Hear me? Yeah. So, Lucas, are you coming to Orlando for Food and Wine Festival?
I
We'd
don't-
love to
I mean,
host you, and
we'll
we
have to
miss
see
you,
how
and
the
we
plague
wanna go
goes.
up there for Food and Wine.
Yeah,
I
we'll
got
have
a
to
question too.
the plague goes well.
Yes,
Plan.
vaccinated.
Yeah, maybe we'll bring
Okay,
Adam.
let's hope for
Adam would've
better
been
times.
Hi, Luke.
Yeah.
Cheers from Virginia.
Well done.
You guys, thanks
everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank
Cheers from Ohio.
Thank you.
Cheers from
Michigan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's everyone. Thank you. Thanks,
I'm
Adam.
hosting you all from
Appreciate it.
Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Cheers from Chicago.
Spasiba from Russia.
Cheers from Nebraska.
Marin County, California.
Yeah, Marin County. There we go.
Here's from Molly's home state.
Cheers from Denver.
Las Vegas.
Cheers from Atlanta.
Cheers from Boulder.
Cheers from
Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed the wine. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, or you can go to another Zoom another time.
That's amazing.
You gotta go to.
Thank you. Adam.
June, everyone else drops off to like credits on cartoons. Cool to have.
Oh, Bill and Julie. Bill and Julie. Adam, Bill and Julie. You guys haven't met in person.
Yeah,
Hey, how are you?
We have one more hour.
don't worry, read the chat afterwards. We were trash talking the whole time.
Listen, Patty.
We've already made friends with the ladies. No one did.
Well,
I won next time. I think the Weber should play for me.
Microwave, we good.
Probably hearing everyone.
Which one, the red?
Yeah, they're hearing everyone.
I'm put on my rosé. Oh my God.
Are there any questions I didn't answer? If you have, put them in the chat. I can't really hear anyone.
Lucas, I'm excited about your bubbles.
I know.
Too. We really like making dumb bubbles.
Okay, I'm telling Diana the truth. You have to be a little while.
Yeah, Diana, you're gonna have to come tell me how shitty of a job we're doing when you have some time.
Huh?
I felt
They're gonna have to learn how
I
to
can't wait
do
to
this.
try them.
Yeah, no, we have so we have the 2 Pinot Noir Pinot we did this. So we captured the first ferment, and then the Verdella we did the year before, and then we have 6 more base wines.
hey, Lucas, do you know Diana's hometown?
No.
It's Ennis, Texas is my
Oh,
hometown.
Ennis, Texas. Yeah, so we're named after Ennis, Montana.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where the name comes from.
Dana all him meets himself.
All right. I'm going to